It was the summer of 2014 when I took a job working for a small logging company in northern Minnesota. I wasn't a professional by any means, just someone who needed money and wasn't afraid of hard work. My boss, an older guy named Roger, had recently purchased a plot of land deep in the woods, a good 50 miles from the nearest town. He planned on cutting down a section of trees, milling them, and using the lumber to build a few rental cabins for hunters. Until then, someone needed to stay on site, keeping an eye on the equipment and making sure no one came snooping around. That's where I came in. The cabin I was given to stay in wasn't much. A simple single-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a rickety table that looked like it had been built decades ago. There was no running water, no electricity, and the only way in or out was a winding dirt road that barely passed for a trail. Roger gave me a satellite phone in case of emergencies, told me he'd be back in a week to check on things, and left me with enough supplies to last until then. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days stacking firewood, making sure the generators were fueled, and walking the property to familiarize myself with the area. The nearest structure was an abandoned shack about half a mile away. I didn't know its history, and honestly, I didn't care. It was falling apart, covered in moss, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The only thing that mattered to me was that it was empty. By the fourth night, I started noticing small things that felt off. It started with little noises outside the cabin. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Nothing too alarming, but strange considering how isolated I was. I told myself it was just animals moving through the woods, but the feeling of being watched never really left me. Then I found the footprints. It had rained overnight, and the ground outside the cabin was soft with mud. When I stepped out that morning, I saw them, deep, heavy prints leading from the tree line straight to my cabin's door. My first thought was that Roger had come by unexpectedly, but the tracks didn't lead back. Whoever had made them had walked up to the door, stood there for a while, and then turned around and left the way they came. I hadn't heard a vehicle. There was no sign of anyone else around. I checked the lock on the cabin door, even though I knew I had bolted it the night before. It was still locked. Nothing inside had been disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping into my gut. Someone had been outside my cabin in the middle of the night, standing there, watching. That day, I walked the perimeter of the property, trying to find any sign of who had been there. I found nothing. No tire tracks, no sign of a campsite, nothing that suggested another person had been anywhere nearby. It didn't make sense. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside had me sitting up in bed, straining to hear. A few times, I swore I heard footsteps, but they were too light, too careful, almost like someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. I gripped the hunting knife I kept by my bed, willing myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I found something worse than footprints. Near the tree line, about 30 feet from the cabin, someone had placed a small pile of rocks. They weren't there the day before. It was a deliberate stack, too perfect to be natural. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of marker left by hunters, but the placement didn't make sense. It was positioned so that, from the right angle, it had a clear line of sight to my cabin. Someone had been watching me. I kicked the pile over, then spent most of the day gathering firewood, making as much noise as possible. I wanted whoever was out there to know that I wasn't some helpless camper. That night, I kept my knife close and slept with my boots on, just in case. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps just outside the cabin. My pulse slammed in my ears as I lay there, listening. The steps were careful, almost measured. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting. A moment later, the doorknob rattled. My stomach clenched. The door was locked, but that didn't matter. Someone was testing it, seeing if I had left it open. I gripped my knife tighter, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. No retreating footsteps, no rustling leaves, just silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, half expecting to see more footprints. But the only new thing I found was a second pile of rocks, right where the first one had been. This time, I didn't touch it. I had a choice to make. I could stay and risk another night, or I could leave. But leaving meant a long walk through the woods before I even reached the dirt road, and if whoever was out there wanted to stop me, I'd be exposed the entire way. I decided to stay one more night. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I needed answers. That evening, I set up a trap. I tied a few tin cans together and hung them from a string near the door. If someone tried to approach, they'd make noise. I also placed my axe near the bed, within easy reach. I barely slept. Sometime past midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't careful. They were fast. Then, the tin cans clattered against each other, and something slammed into the door. I bolted upright, gripping my knife. The door shook, rattling on its hinges. Then silence. For what felt like hours, I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the next noise. But it never came. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. The second rock pile was gone. In its place was something else. A deer skull, stripped clean, placed directly in front of my cabin. That was it. I packed my things, grabbed the satellite phone, and called Roger. He didn't answer. I didn't care. I was done. I threw my gear into the truck, gunned the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. I never told Roger what happened. When he finally called back a few days later, I just told him I wasn't cut out for the job. I didn't want to explain. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who or what had been out there with me. I never planned to stay at the cabin for long. It was supposed to be a quiet, temporary retreat, a place where I could clear my mind, away from the noise of the city. My uncle had owned the property for years, but he rarely stayed there. He had bought it as a cheap investment, more for the land than the cabin itself. It was old, run down, and sat on the edge of an abandoned cemetery. I wasn't thrilled about the location, but I figured I wouldn't be there long enough for it to matter. I just needed a break, a couple of months at most. I had been dealing with too much stress, and the idea of a secluded place where I could be alone sounded perfect. The drive out there was long, stretching through miles of empty countryside. The closest town was about a half-hour away, and even that wasn't much. A handful of stores, a gas station, and a diner. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was already beginning to dip below the treeline. The sky had that cold, grayish tint that always seemed to linger in the autumn months. I parked the truck on the patch of dirt beside the cabin and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and earth. Everything around me was still. No cars, no people. Just the sound of wind pushing through the trees. The cabin itself looked worse than I remembered. The wooden boards were cracked and splintered in places, the roof sagged slightly, and the windows were covered in grime. It was clear that no one had taken care of it in years. I grabbed my bags from the truck and walked up the short steps to the porch. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Dust floated in the air, settling on the wooden floor and the old furniture. The place smelled of damp wood and neglect. I dropped my bags in the small living room and moved to open the windows, letting in some fresh air. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. There was no TV, no internet, no distractions. That was the point. After setting up my things, I went outside to take a better look at my surroundings. The trees pressed close to the cabin, their bare branches swaying slightly. Beyond them, just past the backyard, was the cemetery. I had seen it before, but it always made me uneasy. It wasn't a proper graveyard with neat rows of headstones. It was old, forgotten. The stones were crumbling, some knocked over, half buried in the earth. The graves were scattered randomly, no organization to them. Some of the wooden crosses had rotted down to nothing. I didn't like looking at it for too long. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking, cooking a simple meal and settling in. As the sun fully disappeared, the temperature dropped, and I started a fire in the old wood stove. It crackled softly, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. That night, I barely slept, not because of fear or discomfort, but because of the absolute stillness. I wasn't used to it. The quiet was so deep it felt unnatural, as if I had stepped into a place that had been abandoned by the rest of the world. Then, around midnight, I heard something. A soft, distant sound, barely there. It wasn't a voice, not footsteps, something else. A faint movement in the trees, a shifting. I sat up in bed, listening, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was the wind. The next day, I busied myself with repairs. I fixed up some of the broken furniture, cleaned the dust-covered windows, and patched a few holes in the walls. I chopped wood for the stove and stacked it neatly outside. As the sun began to set again, I made the mistake of looking toward the cemetery. Something was different. One of the gravestones near the edge of the woods had fallen over. I was sure it had been upright the day before. Maybe it had been loose, knocked over by the wind or a passing animal. I told myself that and went back inside. That night, I heard it again. A sound outside. Closer. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind, it was movement. Something shifting through the leaves. Something deliberate. I got up slowly, moving to the window. The fire in the wood stove cast a faint glow across the room, but outside was pure darkness. Then I saw it. A shape, not an animal, not a person, just a dark outline standing near the tree-line, near the cemetery. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. The figure didn't either. I stared for what felt like forever, my mind racing. Then, without a sound, it stepped backward, slowly vanishing into the trees. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening, waiting, but the sound never returned. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it. Lack of sleep, stress, paranoia. The cemetery played tricks on my mind. I decided to check the gravestones. The one that had fallen over was different again. It had been moved, turned slightly. That was when I noticed the footprints. Not fresh, not deep, but there, just barely pressed into the damp earth, leading toward the cabin. I tried to shake the unease, but it stayed with me all day. I kept checking the windows, glancing toward the trees, waiting for something. That night, I locked the doors and windows, stoked the fire, and sat awake with a knife in my hand. The sound returned, closer, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves outside the window. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then 3 slow taps on the window. I stopped breathing. I didn't move. Minutes passed. An hour. The sound never came again. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things as fast as I could, shoving everything into my truck. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to be gone. As I started the engine, I risked one last glance at the cemetery. The gravestone had been moved again, but this time the name was visible, the same last name as mine. I didn't stay long enough to read the rest. I just drove, leaving the cabin behind, leaving whatever was out there behind. I never told my uncle, never asked him about the history of the place. I just knew I wouldn't be going back, and I never did. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, when the world is too quiet, I remember the sound of those slow, deliberate taps against the window, and I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. It was late autumn when I found myself on that lonely stretch of road, the kind that carves through the woods like a forgotten scar. The leaves had turned shades of rust and gold, but the sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I had finished a job at my boss's property a few miles back. Some maintenance work, fixing up fences, checking on the well, that sort of thing. He had mentioned that his grandmother's old cabin was nearby, tucked away in the thick trees. "Don't bother stopping," he had said offhandedly, his tone casual but firm. No one's been there for years. I hadn't planned on stopping. My only goal was to make it home before the weather turned. The road was narrow, cracked in places, and winding enough that I had to keep both hands tight on the wheel. The sun had dipped below the treetops, and the light was fading fast. I passed the turnoff where I knew the cabin was, just a barely visible path cutting into the trees. And that's when I noticed something strange. There was a car, an old one, parked just off the road near the entrance to that path. It wasn't a modern vehicle, more like something from the early 2000s. It was dark green, caked in dirt, and the windows were fogged up. The way it sat there, angled awkwardly with one wheel slightly off the road, made it look like someone had pulled in fast and left in a hurry. But I hadn't seen anyone. There were no fresh footprints in the dirt or signs of movement in the trees. A part of me told me to keep driving. It wasn't my business. But another part, the part that knew how empty these roads could be at night, made me slow down. What if someone was inside, injured, or in trouble? I pulled over onto the shoulder, keeping my truck running. The moment I stepped out, I felt the cold settle deep into my bones. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and earth, and the only sound was the rustling of branches overhead. I approached the car cautiously, peering through the driver's side window. The inside was a mess. There were old food wrappers, a few empty water bottles, and a torn-up map sitting on the passenger seat. The back seat was cluttered with clothes, but there was no sign of anyone. That should have been my cue to leave. But my eyes caught something else. The driver's door wasn't fully closed. It was cracked open just enough that the cabin light should have been on. But it wasn't. The car's battery must have been dead. I reached out and nudged the door open wider. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't just the stale, musty scent of an abandoned car. It was something worse, rotting, pungent, like meat left out too long. I took a step back, my stomach twisting. Then I saw them. Footprints. They led away from the car, disappearing into the overgrown path toward the cabin. It didn't make sense. If someone had abandoned the car, why would they head deeper into the woods instead of toward the road? That was the moment I should have left. But I didn't. I told myself I'd just follow the footprints a little way, just enough to see if someone needed help. The path was barely visible, more like an animal trail than a real road. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. Then up ahead I saw it, the cabin. It was old, even older than I expected. The roof sagged in places, and the walls were dark with years of exposure. There was no glass in the windows anymore, just empty frames staring out like hollow eyes. The door was slightly ajar, swinging faintly with the breeze. I stopped just before the clearing, every instinct in me screaming that something was wrong. Then I saw the second set of footprints. They were fresh, and they were coming out of the cabin. I wasn't alone. I turned around immediately, moving fast but careful to keep my steps quiet. My truck wasn't far. I could make it back, get inside, and be gone in less than 5 minutes. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate rustling in the trees. Someone was moving. I picked up my pace, forcing myself not to run. Running made noise. Running made you a target. The trees thinned. I could see the road ahead. My truck. The door still open. The engine still running. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepping out from the trees. He was tall but thin. Too thin. His clothes were dark, blending into the shadows, but his face was pale, almost white, and his eyes. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I reached my truck, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. The moment I locked the doors, something slammed against the back of the truck. I didn't look. I threw it into gear and hit the gas. Gravel sprayed as I sped down the road, my heart hammering. In the rearview mirror, the figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I didn't stop driving. By the time I made it home, my hands were still shaking. I never told my boss what happened. Never mentioned the car, the footprints, the figure in the woods. A few weeks later, I heard a rumor. Someone had gone missing near that road. A hiker. No one had found him. I don't go near that cabin anymore, and I don't pass that road at night. I had been working as a forestry surveyor for a little over 5 years when I got assigned to a project that took me deep into a remote stretch of woodland. It was an old-growth forest, dense and unwelcoming, the kind of place where silence sat heavy between the trees. My job was simple in theory: stay in a cabin, mark out designated areas for clearing, and report back after a couple of weeks. Simple but lonely. The company had an old logging cabin out there, used decades ago but abandoned when the area was deemed too difficult for large-scale operations. It was sturdy, they said, reinforced over the years by other surveyors and loggers who had passed through. I wasn't new to solitude or hard conditions, so I accepted the assignment without hesitation. The drive was long, miles of empty road before I had to switch to a rugged path barely fit for my truck. I reached the cabin just before dusk. It was an old thing, sitting in a clearing with its back against a steep incline. The wooden walls were darkened by time, the roof patched with mismatched shingles. There was a small porch, a single window with thick shutters, and a heavy door with a rusted lock. It smelled of damp wood and age when I stepped inside. The inside was simple: a cot, a wooden table with a chair, a shelf with some supplies, and an old wood-burning stove. The last surveyor had left some notes, warnings about the unreliable generator, the occasional bear sighting, and a reminder to stack firewood early since the forest got cold at night. The first few days passed without much trouble. I worked during the day, marking trees and mapping trails. The forest was dense, and moving through it was slow. The trees were enormous, their canopies so thick that even midday felt like early evening. The wind barely reached the ground, and everything smelled of damp earth and pine. At night, the cabin felt much smaller than it did during the day. I kept a fire going, cooked simple meals, and read through my notes. The silence was something I was used to, but there was something about the quiet in that forest that felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like something was always listening. By the fourth day, I started noticing small things that put me on edge. First, my tools had been moved. Not in a way that suggested I had misplaced them, something deliberate. My measuring tape was unrolled and draped over the table. My axe, which I had left leaning against the wall, was stuck upright in the wooden floor. I told myself I must have done it without thinking, tired from the long days. Then there were the tracks. I had woken up early, just before dawn, and stepped outside to take a piss. The ground was damp from the night's rain, soft enough to show impressions. There were footprints in the mud, circling the cabin. They were human, barefoot, long strides, but they weren't mine. I tried to stay rational. Maybe an old hunter or another surveyor had passed through, curious about the cabin. But it didn't make sense. I had seen no sign of anyone else out here. That night, I secured the cabin before sleeping. The shutters were locked, the door barricaded from the inside. The fire burned low, filling the space with warmth. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was soft, almost careful, like someone was testing the ground with each step. I lay still, my breath shallow. The sound moved to the door, stopping just outside. Then came the slow, deliberate scrape of something dragging across the wood. I sat up, heart hammering, reaching for my knife. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed. Then, from the other side of the room, I heard the floorboards creak. Inside the cabin, I turned so fast I nearly knocked over the chair next to the cot. The fire had burned low, casting weak orange light that barely reached the corners of the room. Nothing was there. The door was still barricaded. The window shutters were closed. I stayed awake until morning, sitting with my back against the wall, knife in hand. When daylight came, I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing. The only thing out of place was the chair by the table. It had been pulled out, slightly angled toward my cot. I spent the day working, trying to push away the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest felt different. The silence was heavier. The trees looked closer together, the spaces between them darker. That night, I kept the fire roaring, not letting it die down. I forced myself to eat to keep my routine normal. I checked the door 3 times before lying down. Sleep came slowly. I woke up to the sound of the door handle turning. Not rattling, not shaking, just a slow, careful turn, as if whoever was outside was testing to see if it was unlocked. The barricade held. I didn't move. The handle stopped turning. Silence. Then a whisper of movement, the soft scrape of feet stepping away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my things. The job wasn't done, but I didn't care. When I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. There. Dozens of them circling the cabin. Some led into the forest, but none came from it. I didn't think. I got into my truck, turned the key, and drove. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached the nearest town hours later, shaking from exhaustion. I told my boss I was done with the project. I didn't explain why. I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was just some drifter, someone living off the grid. Maybe I was overreacting. But I know one thing. I had locked the door, and in the morning when I left, it was open. I never went back. I never thought much about isolation until I stayed in that cabin. I had spent time alone before, gone on long hikes, camped in remote areas, but nothing quite like this. The woods of southern France seemed peaceful when I arrived, too peaceful in hindsight. It was late September, and the summer crowds had long since vanished, leaving the forests empty except for the occasional hunter or traveler passing through. I was staying in an old, one-room cabin deep in the woods near the Dordogne region. It belonged to a friend of a friend, some retired man who had inherited the land and rarely used it. It wasn't much, just a single-room structure with a wood-burning stove, a cot, and a small kitchen area with a rusted sink. There was no electricity, only an old oil lantern and a stockpile of candles. I had driven in with enough supplies for a week. Canned food, a few bottles of water, some dry firewood, and a hunting knife. The plan was simple. Enjoy the solitude, take some photographs, and get away from the noise of the city. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring the nearby trails, taking in the crisp autumn air, and snapping pictures of the thick, moss-covered trees. There was something about the silence that was both calming and unsettling. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. That first night, I built a small fire outside and cooked some canned beans. The sky was clear, the stars bright. It felt like I had the entire world to myself. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The cabin was dark. The fire outside had long since died down, and the woods were silent. But something had pulled me from my sleep. A noise, maybe. I lay still for a moment, listening. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard it again. A faint crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. My first thought was an animal. A deer, maybe, or a fox. I reached for my knife, just in case, and sat up. Silence. Then another crunch, this time closer. I moved slowly toward the door and pressed my ear against the wood. The sound was coming from just beyond the tree line, maybe 15 or 20 meters away. It wasn't the erratic movement of an animal. It was steady, almost like footsteps. I waited, gripping the knife tightly. Then, nothing. After several minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch had fallen, or the wind had stirred the leaves. I crawled back into my cot, but I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the area outside. Nothing unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, just the same undisturbed forest floor. I brushed it off as paranoia and went about my day. By the second night, I had almost forgotten about it. I made a small dinner, drank some water, and sat outside for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Then, just like the night before, I woke up suddenly. It was the same feeling, like something had disturbed me just enough to pull me out of sleep. I lay still, waiting. Then I heard it, closer this time. The sound of footsteps. Not the heavy steps of a large animal, not the light scurrying of a fox or rabbit. These were human footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. My heart pounded. I reached for my knife and listened. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. Silence. I held my breath, I couldn't hear anything, but I could feel it, that presence just outside. Then the doorknob rattled. Not violently, not forcefully, just enough to test if it was unlocked. I gripped my knife tighter, my hands clammy with sweat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, slowly fading into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my things. I had planned to stay a week, but I wasn't taking any chances. I wasn't waiting to see who or what was outside that cabin at night. I checked the area again before leaving. No tracks, no signs of disturbance, just the same quiet, empty woods. I drove away, back toward civilization, leaving the cabin behind. I never told my friend what happened. I don't know if I imagined it, if it was just paranoia, or if someone had really been out there, watching me. All I know is that I never went back, and I never will. It was late October when I decided to take a break from everything. The past few months had been exhausting. Work, personal issues, everything piling up. I needed space. I needed quiet. So, I packed up and drove out to a small cabin I had rented deep in the mountains. It wasn't my first time out there, but I had never gone alone before. The place was about a 3-hour drive from town. Far enough that I wouldn't hear traffic or deal with people, but close enough that I could get back if something happened. The road leading up to it was rough, mostly gravel and dirt, cutting through thick forests with no streetlights. By the time I got there, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was small but solid. A single-story structure with a pitched roof, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch. The nearest neighbor was miles away, but I didn't mind. That was the point. I unpacked, made a quick meal, and settled in. The silence was almost too much at first. No sirens, no cars, no voices. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of leaves. It should have been peaceful, but something about it made me uneasy. I didn't sleep well. It wasn't that I was scared. Not yet. But the sounds outside kept pulling me from sleep. Every now and then, I'd hear movement. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. Could have been anything, raccoons, deer, maybe even a bear. But it felt wrong. The noises weren't random. They had a pattern, like something pacing around the cabin. I told myself I was imagining it. I was out in the woods, alone, my mind playing tricks on me. But when I woke up the next morning, I found something strange. Tracks. They weren't boot prints. They weren't even animal tracks, not any that I recognized. They were long, too long, and deep, like something with weight had moved through. The strangest part was how they circled the cabin, over and over. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had made them last night, though I didn't remember walking around in the dark. Maybe it was just the wind making patterns in the dirt. I didn't know. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. The trails were quiet, untouched. I saw a few deer, some birds, but nothing unusual. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting again. I made dinner, read for a while, and told myself I was being ridiculous, until the noises started again. It was worse this time, louder, closer. I lay in bed, listening. The footsteps weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. They moved slowly, circling, stopping, then starting again. I had locked the doors, shut the windows, but I still felt exposed, like something was watching me. Then came the smell. It drifted in through the walls, thick and rotten, like something dead had been left out in the sun for too long. I covered my nose, trying not to gag. The footsteps stopped. The cabin was silent. The smell lingered, but everything else was still. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises were gone. I barely slept, but when morning came, I forced myself outside. The tracks were there again, circling the cabin. But this time, they led off into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. They weren't normal. The strides were too long, the shape of the prints all wrong. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. But who would come all the way out here just to scare some guy in a cabin? I followed them a few yards into the trees before stopping. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I turned back. That was the moment I decided I would leave in the morning. I locked everything, checked twice. I kept the fire going, the rifle close by. I didn't care if it was paranoia. I wasn't taking chances. The noises came back around midnight. At first, it was the footsteps, slow, deliberate. Then the breathing. It was faint, but I heard it, just outside the window. Low, raspy, wrong. I didn't move. Then came the scratching. Long, slow drags against the wooden walls. Not claws, but something harder, rougher. It moved around the cabin, scratching, scraping, circling me. Then it stopped. Silence. And then, knocking. Not at the door, at the window. Soft, rhythmic, like it was trying to get my attention. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The knocking came again. And then, from outside, something whispered my name. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair, rifle in my lap, waiting for the sun to come up. When light finally broke through the trees, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't look at the tracks outside. I didn't check the windows. I just got in my truck and left. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking, breath ragged. I looked back once, just once. There, at the tree line, something was standing. Tall, too tall, its limbs too long, its head slightly tilted. Watching me, I slammed my foot on the gas and didn't look back again. I never told anyone what happened. Not really, but I never went back to that cabin. Never again. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it. Knocking. I took the last turn off the paved road, my truck bouncing slightly as I hit the dirt path leading up to the cabin. It was late in the afternoon, and the shadows stretched long across the narrow road, the light barely filtering through the thick trees surrounding me on both sides. I hadn't been out here in years, but I still remembered every bump and curve in the path. My uncle used to own this place, and when he passed, the cabin had been left to me. I had no real connection to it, no childhood memories of summers spent fishing or hunting, just a vague recollection of a single weekend trip when I was a kid. But I needed a break, and I figured a long weekend away from work and noise wouldn't hurt. The last few months had been exhausting. My job had me stretched thin, my social life had faded, and even sleep felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. A weekend of quiet, just me, my truck, and the woods. No cell service, no emails, no one to talk to. That was exactly what I needed. The driveway was nothing more than a break in the tree line, and I almost missed it in the fading light. The cabin sat a little ways in, just far enough from the road that you wouldn't see it unless you were looking for it. As I pulled up, I got my first real look at the place in years. It was smaller than I remembered. A simple wooden structure with a covered porch and a chimney that looked like it hadn't seen smoke in a decade. The windows were dusty, the roof had seen better days, and the front steps creaked as I walked up to the door. I unlocked it and stepped inside, the air stale with the smell of dust and wood that had been left to sit too long. The place was basic, one large room that served as both the living area and kitchen, a small bathroom, and a single bedroom off to the side. The furniture was old but solid, the kind that looked like it had been around for 50 years and would still be here 50 more. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and I spent the first hour wiping down the counters and sweeping the floors before finally settling in. The silence was almost overwhelming. No cars in the distance, no hum of electricity, just the wind moving through the trees outside and the occasional creak of the old wooden walls. It was peaceful in a way, but also unnerving. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. I spent the first night by the fireplace, reading by lantern light. There was no power out here, no running water besides what I had brought with me. The fire crackled, the warmth seeping into my skin as I let myself relax. I hadn't realized how much I needed this. I went to bed late, the air cold against my skin as I settled into the old bed with a pile of blankets. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees, making them groan in the darkness. I barely noticed when I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, my heart beating a little faster than I liked, I realized it was different. The wind made the trees sway, made the branches rub against each other. But this was movement, something deliberate, something heavy. I sat up slowly, listening. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. The sound came again, a crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but then I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, someone walking just outside the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps moved from the side of the house toward the porch. My truck was parked just a few feet away. Whoever it was had to know I was here. They had to have seen the light from the fire. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping out of bed and grabbing the rifle I had brought with me. It wasn't loaded, but I didn't think I'd need to fire it. Just having it in my hands made me feel a little more in control. I stood in the dark, listening. The footsteps had stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat up with my back against the wall, the rifle across my lap, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, the dark shadows fading into the early morning gray. I stepped outside as the sun rose, my breath visible in the cold air. There were tracks in the dirt, footprints. I wasn't imagining it. The tracks circled the cabin, leading from the tree line, past the porch and back into the woods. Someone had been out here. I spent the day trying to shake the unease from the night before. I chopped firewood, took a short hike down to the lake, and tried to convince myself that it was probably just some hunter passing through. But the feeling stayed, that heavy weight in my chest, the sense that I wasn't alone out here. That night, I barricaded the door. I wedged a chair under the handle, placed a heavy log against the back door, and sat by the fire with my rifle loaded this time. I wasn't taking any chances. The night passed in silence. No footsteps, no movement. By the time the sun came up, I felt ridiculous. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the tracks had been old, or I had just imagined the footsteps being so close. Either way, I decided to stay one more night. I wasn't going to let my own paranoia ruin this trip. That evening, I sat outside on the porch, drinking a beer and watching the last of the daylight disappear. The woods were calm, the air still, and then I saw it, a shape just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. I stared at it for what felt like forever, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, slowly, it stepped back, disappearing into the trees. That was enough for me. I packed up what little I had brought and loaded my truck in record time. I didn't care if it was late, if I had to drive all night. I wasn't staying out here. As I pulled away from the cabin, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just darkness, just trees. By the time I hit the main road, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the property a few months later, never told the new owners about that weekend. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe there was a logical explanation, but I know what I saw, and I know I was never alone out there. I never thought much about what fear truly was until I spent that winter in the mountains of Montana. It wasn't the creeping kind of fear you get from watching too many horror movies or the momentary jolt of panic when you hear a strange sound in the dark. No, this was different. It was slow, relentless, and impossible to shake once it settled in. The kind that makes you question every decision you've ever made. The kind that changes you. It started with a simple enough idea. Spend the winter in my uncle's old hunting cabin deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. I was between jobs, tired of the city, and thought a few months of isolation would do me some good. No distractions, no obligations, just time to clear my head. Maybe even write that book I'd always told myself I would. It sounded almost peaceful. The cabin itself was nothing special. Just a small wooden structure built decades ago, nestled between thick pines at the end of an old logging road. There was no electricity, no running water, and the nearest town was nearly 40 miles away. The only connection to the outside world was an old battery-powered radio and a weather-worn map my uncle had left behind. I brought enough supplies to last me a few months: canned food, rice, dried beans, and a few luxuries like coffee and whiskey. I had a rifle for hunting, an axe for firewood, and a notebook to fill with words. First, it was everything I had hoped for. The quiet was almost overwhelming, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making even the smallest sounds feel unnaturally loud. The first few weeks passed in a blur of simple routines: cutting wood, melting snow for water, cooking over the wood stove, and taking long hikes through the snow-covered forest. I felt free in a way I hadn't in years. But then, as January settled in, the weather turned vicious. The temperature dropped well below zero, and the wind howled through the trees like a living thing. Snow piled up against the cabin walls, burying the world outside in an endless white void. I was trapped. That's when the unease began. It started with small things. One night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not the wind, not falling branches, something deliberate. Slow, crunching footsteps in the snow. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. The steps stopped just outside the cabin, near the front door. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing, gripping the rifle I kept next to my bed. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it had just been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a coyote. But when I opened the door the next morning, I saw the tracks. Human, boot prints in the fresh snow. They led from the treeline to my cabin and then back into the woods. I told myself someone had just gotten lost, maybe a hunter passing through. But the thing that bothered me was that they hadn't approached the cabin for shelter or knocked on the door. They had just stood there, watching. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened. Always around midnight. Footsteps in the snow, stopping just outside the cabin. No knocking, no calls for help. Just silence. I stopped going outside after dark. The snow kept falling, and soon I couldn't even see the road I had come in on. I was completely cut off. The only thing keeping me sane was the knowledge that winter wouldn't last forever. By March, the snow would start to melt, and I could leave. I just had to make it until then. But the footsteps kept coming. And then, one night, they didn't stop. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for them. The routine had become almost predictable. The sound of boots crunching through the snow, the pause outside my door, the long silence before they left. But this time, they didn't leave. Instead, I heard something new, the sound of my door handle turning. I bolted upright, gripping the rifle with both hands, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door was locked. Thank God I had started locking it. But the knob twisted back and forth as whoever was outside tested it. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate knocking. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocking continued, patient, almost polite. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, but they didn't retreat into the woods. They circled the cabin. I could hear them crunching through the snow, moving from window to window. I had covered them with blankets, but I could feel whoever it was standing just on the other side of the thin wooden walls, looking in. They stayed there for hours, just standing, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, listening. When dawn finally came, I dared to peek outside. The snow was covered in footprints, circling the cabin over and over again. But there were no signs of where they had gone. The tracks just stopped, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I should have left then, should have packed what I could and started walking. But I didn't. The thought of stepping into those woods, knowing someone was out there watching me, was worse than the thought of staying. So I waited. For 3 more nights, there was nothing. No footsteps, no knocking. I started to believe, foolishly, that maybe whoever it was had moved on. That maybe I had imagined it. Then, on the 4th night, I woke up to a different sound. Not footsteps, breathing, right outside the window. Deep, slow breathing, just inches from where I lay. I didn't move, didn't blink. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, gripping my rifle so tightly my hands ached. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped, and then, a whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it. But I had. I didn't sleep again after that. By the time the storm finally broke and I could leave, I was barely holding on. I packed what little I could carry, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and started walking. The snow was deep, the wind bitter, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I never looked back. It took me 3 days to reach the nearest road, where I managed to flag down a passing truck. The driver took one look at me, wild-eyed, frostbitten, barely able to speak, and didn't ask any questions. I never told anyone what happened out there. I never went back. My uncle's cabin is still out there, buried under the snow, waiting for another poor fool to come looking for solitude. Maybe they'll be lucky, maybe they won't, but I know one thing for sure: they won't be alone. I never should have taken that road. That's what I kept telling myself afterward. There are a lot of things in life that we look back on and think, if I had done this differently, I wouldn't be here right now. But sometimes we don't get to make those choices again. Sometimes we're just stuck with them. It started with a simple mistake, one that felt small at the time. I was on my way back from a work trip in the fall of 2019, driving through the mountains of West Virginia. I had been up since before sunrise, and by the time the afternoon faded into the early evening, I felt the weight of exhaustion creeping in. The GPS said I had about 2 more hours to go before I reached home. My phone was at 9%, and I hadn't brought my charger. Stupid mistake. But I wasn't too worried. I'd driven these roads before, and I knew the general direction I needed to go. Then I saw the detour sign. A section of the highway ahead was blocked off due to roadwork, and the bright orange signs pointed me toward a narrow side road that twisted through the forest. I hesitated. The road looked rough, cracked pavement with weeds poking through the gaps. My gut told me to turn around and find another route, but I was too tired, too impatient to waste time. I took the turn. First, it didn't seem too bad. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers. The further I drove, the rougher the pavement became until it was nothing more than packed dirt and gravel. My tires crunched over loose stones, and dust billowed in my rearview mirror. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The road was winding, narrow, and completely empty. The deeper I went, the darker it got, with the thick trees blocking out the evening light. I kept checking my phone, watching the battery drain. 6%, 4%. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. The road ahead was washed out. A section had collapsed, leaving a jagged drop where the ground had crumbled away. I slammed on the brakes just in time, my heart hammering as my headlights illuminated the steep drop-off. Couldn't go forward. Cursing under my breath, I shifted into reverse and started backing up. That's when I felt it. A sudden jolt, a sickening crunch. The car lurched to one side, and I knew, instantly, that I had made a mistake. I put it in park, yanked the emergency brake, and stepped out. The cold air hit me like a slap. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled my nose as I walked around to check the damage. The right rear tire was sunk into a deep rut of soft mud. I got back in, tried to rock the car forward, then back. The tires spun uselessly. I was stuck. My phone? 2%. No signal. Panic set in. I had no idea how far back the last house or town was. The only thing I could do was walk. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, zipped up my jacket, and started walking back the way I had come. The woods were silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. My footsteps crunched over twigs and dirt. I walked for what felt like an hour. My legs ached, and the cold was seeping into my bones. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A structure, a cabin. It sat just off the road, hidden by the thick woods. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were dark, but it was still standing. It looked abandoned, but I didn't care. At that moment, all I wanted was shelter. Somewhere to get warm and wait until morning when I could figure things out. I pushed through the undergrowth, stepping over fallen branches and dead leaves. The cabin had a porch, its wooden steps warped and uneven. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong. But the wind had picked up and I was freezing. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of rot. My flashlight beam swept across the interior, a small one-room space with a fireplace, a broken table, and a single wooden chair. There was a bed in the corner, the mattress torn and stained. I closed the door behind me and exhaled, my breath visible in the dim light. It was quiet, too quiet. I forced myself to sit down, telling myself I'd rest for just a little while before heading back to the car. That's when I saw them, the footprints. They were in the dust on the wooden floor, leading from the doorway to the far side of the room. And they weren't mine. The air in my lungs froze. My eyes followed the prints to the corner of the cabin where an old wardrobe stood. The door was slightly open. Someone had been here. Recently, prickle of fear crawled up my spine. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. My breathing was too loud. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I strained to hear anything, any sign of movement. Then the sound came, a slow, deliberate creak. From inside the wardrobe. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Then another sound, a whisper of fabric, a shift of weight. Someone was inside that wardrobe. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just bolted out the door and into the woods, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I crashed through the undergrowth. Branches slapped my face. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I saw the glow of headlights. A truck. It was an old man, a hunter by the look of him. He rolled down his window, and without hesitation, I waved him down. He took one look at me, at my wide eyes, my dirt-covered clothes, and nodded. He didn't ask questions. I told him about the cabin, about the footprints, about the wardrobe. His expression darkened. "That road's been closed for years," he muttered. "Ain't no cabins out here anymore." I turned to look back toward the trees. There was nothing, just darkness. When the tow truck came the next morning, my car was still there, stuck in the same muddy rut. But when I asked the driver about the cabin, he just shook his head. "No cabins out here, man," he said. "Not for a long time. I never found that place again." I checked maps, I searched records, but there was nothing. I don't know what I walked into that night. I don't know who or what was inside that wardrobe, but I do know this. I never took that road again. I never should have gone back to that cabin. It had been nearly 15 years since I last set foot there, but some places don't lose their grip on you. My uncle had owned it before he passed. A small wooden place deep in the forests of British Columbia. I had spent summers there as a kid, learning how to fish, chop wood, and navigate the wilderness. But once my uncle died, the place just sat empty, slowly rotting away with time. A few weeks ago, I found out that my father had inherited the property and planned to sell it. That news stirred something inside me. I told myself it was nostalgia, that I wanted to see the place one last time before it was gone forever. But deep down, I think I had another reason. I wanted to prove to myself that the stories weren't real. See, there was always something strange about the cabin. Even as a kid, I had felt it. The locals would tell stories about hunters going missing, about drifters passing through and never being seen again. I had chalked it up to the wilderness being unforgiving. People got lost. Animals attacked. It happened. But part of me still remembered the unease I had felt in that cabin. The way the woods seemed too quiet at night. The way my uncle never let me wander too far alone. I left on a Friday afternoon, making the 6-hour drive through winding mountain roads. My truck was packed with enough supplies for a weekend, food, water, a rifle just in case. I had no real plan. I just wanted to see the place, soak in the memories, and leave knowing that the cabin was nothing more than an old building in the woods. By the time I got there, The sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the trees. The road leading to the cabin had nearly disappeared, overgrown with bushes and weeds. I had to get out and clear some of it just to get my truck through. And then, finally, I saw it. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. Boards warped from years of rain and snow, windows coated in grime. The front porch sagged, the railing barely holding on. But it was still standing. I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of rotting wood. The furniture was still there, though most of it was covered in mildew. My uncle's old hunting rifle still rested above the fireplace, rusted and useless. The place had been abandoned for so long that it felt like a tomb. But as I stood there, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, a pressure in the air. The woods outside had gone dead silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just stillness. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I spent the next hour cleaning up, sweeping out dust, and making the place livable for the night. I started a fire in the old stone fireplace, cooked up some canned food, and sat down with a bottle of whiskey. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the flames, but eventually, I felt the exhaustion settle in. The drive, the work, it had all worn me out. I decided to turn in early. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and set my rifle next to my cot. The woods had always had bears, and I wasn't about to take any chances. I shut off the lantern, letting the fire be the only source of light, and lay down, listening to the crackling of the flames. At some point in the night, I woke up. Something had changed. The fire was nearly out, just embers glowing in the darkness. But that wasn't what woke me. It was a sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone was walking around the cabin. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tight. My heart was pounding, my body frozen in place. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Silence. Then the doorknob rattled. Not hard, not aggressive, just a slow, testing turn, like someone was checking to see if it was locked. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing. Then the footsteps moved again, this time toward the window. I turned my head just slightly, enough to see the window in the dim light. And that's when I saw him. A figure stood just outside, his face barely visible through the grime-covered glass. He wasn't a hunter, wasn't some lost hiker. He was something else. His head tilted slightly as he peered in, like he was studying me. I could barely make out his features in the darkness, but what I saw made my skin crawl. He was tall, lean, his clothes filthy and torn. His hands rested against the glass, fingers long and thin, smudging the dirt. And then he smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that stretched across his face. I clenched the rifle, my mind racing. Who was he? What did he want? The man stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just staring, that grin never fading. Then, just as slowly as he had come, he stepped back into the darkness. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening for his footsteps. But there was nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally moved. I packed my things in record time, never taking my eyes off the windows. I knew he was still out there, watching. I stepped outside, rifle raised, scanning the tree line. Nothing. But then, as I turned toward my truck, I saw them. Footprints, dozens of them circling the cabin. And at the edge of the trees, carved into the bark of a towering pine, were 3 words. See you soon. I never went back. My father sold the land a few months later, and I never asked who bought it. I didn't want to know, but sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that cabin. And in my dreams, he's still there, watching, waiting. I used to think I was the kind of person who could handle anything. I worked a rough job, lived in a tough neighborhood, and dealt with all kinds of people. I had been in fights, had seen things I wished I hadn't, and had walked home alone through the worst parts of the city without flinching. But none of that prepared me for what happened at that cabin. It was late September, years ago now, and I had just gotten out of a bad stretch of work. I needed a break. Somewhere quiet, somewhere away from people, somewhere I wouldn't have to deal with anything for a while. My cousin Mark had a place up north, deep in the woods, a small cabin he hardly ever used. It wasn't much, but it had a roof, a bed, and a wood stove. That was all I needed. The drive up was long and empty. The deeper I got into the forest, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, it was just me, the cracked road, and miles of trees stretching out on either side. The sun started dipping lower, casting long shadows through the woods. By the time I reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. It was small, just a single room with a lofted area for sleeping. No electricity, no running water, just an old generator and a well out back. Mark had told me there was enough firewood for a few weeks, and if I needed more, there was an axe and a splitting stump behind the cabin. The first night was quiet, too quiet. City life had conditioned me to sleep through sirens, car horns, and people shouting outside my window. Here, the silence was something else entirely. It was heavy, pressing in from all sides. Every small noise, branches shifting in the wind, the creak of the cabin settling, felt sharp against the quiet. Still, I fell asleep fast. The exhaustion of the long drive had wiped me out, and the bed, though old and musty, was comfortable enough. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. A single, deliberate crunch, like a boot stepping on dry leaves. I lay still, heart pounding in my ears. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, a raccoon, but something felt off. I reached over, grabbed the flashlight I had left on the nightstand, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the small windows, but I couldn't see anything outside. I listened. Nothing. After a while, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. First night alone in the woods, it made sense that my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned the flashlight off and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning was normal. The sun was shining, the woods looked peaceful, and I almost laughed at myself for being so jumpy the night before. I spent the day chopping wood, hiking a little, just enjoying the solitude. That night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. Crunch. Closer this time. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, heavy. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight again. Then something scraped against the cabin wall. Not an animal. No animal moves like that. I clicked the flashlight on, aiming it toward the window. For a second, I thought I saw something. A shape, a shadow, something moving just beyond the glass. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I found footprints outside the cabin. Not boot prints, bare feet, and they weren't mine. They were larger, wider, the kind of feet that belonged to a man well over 6 feet tall. They circled the cabin, trailing off into the woods. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into the underbrush. I thought about leaving right then and there, but I didn't. I told myself it was some hiker, some weirdo passing through. Nothing to be scared of. I had a knife, a hatchet. If someone tried to mess with me, I'd be ready. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my skin crawl. Sometime after midnight, I heard something new. Breathing. Low, slow, and heavy. Right outside the cabin. I gripped the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I didn't turn it on. I just listened. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, but it wasn't real sleep. It was that half-aware state where your mind keeps running even as your body shuts down. When I woke up, the front door was open. I knew I had locked it. I had checked it 3 times before going to bed. My skin went cold. The footprints were back. Inside the cabin this time. They led from the door to my bed. And then they led back out. I packed my things in less than 5 minutes. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. The drive back felt longer than the drive up. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole way. Every car I passed, every person I saw, felt unreal, like I had spent years in that cabin instead of just a few nights. I never told Mark what happened. I just thanked him for letting me use the place and never went back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I took the ranger job because I liked the quiet. The idea of working alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees, the sounds of nature, and the steady rhythm of the seasons. There was something peaceful about it. The isolation didn't bother me. I didn't need constant noise or people. I had done my time in the city, lived through years of crowded streets, cramped apartments, and the never-ending hum of cars and voices. I was done with that. I wanted space, silence, and a job that didn't demand much beyond keeping an eye on the land and making sure no one did anything stupid out here. The park itself was big, miles of dense forest, rocky trails, and deep valleys where the trees blocked out the sky. I had been assigned a section of the park that didn't see many visitors. There were no tourist-friendly trails, no campgrounds, just wilderness. The kind of place that didn't draw in casual hikers, only experienced ones or people who wanted to get away from everything. My cabin was about 12 miles from the nearest paved road, at the end of a dirt path that wasn't even marked on most maps. It was an old structure, built decades ago when rangers actually lived out here year-round. One big room with a bed, a desk, a wood-burning stove, and a radio. The bathroom was an outhouse about 50 feet behind the cabin, which wasn't great in the winter, but I managed. I had a truck, a radio for check-ins, a rifle in case of wild animals, and enough supplies to last weeks. That was the job. Stay out here, watch the land, make sure no one was breaking any rules, and report anything unusual. The first few weeks were easy. I spent my days hiking the trails, checking on old fire watchtowers, making notes on the weather, and writing reports about the wildlife. At night, I sat on the porch, listened to the wind move through the trees, and let my mind empty out. The silence was good, felt clean. Then things started happening. First, it was little things. I'd come back from a hike and find the door to the cabin slightly open. I was sure I had closed it. The first time, I figured I had just forgotten. The second time, I felt a little uneasy. I started locking it every time I left, making sure to double-check, but a few days later, I came back and found it open again. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe the door didn't latch right. Maybe I hadn't locked it as well as I thought. But I started keeping my rifle a little closer. Then I noticed food missing. Nothing major, just a can of beans here, a pack of jerky there. But I knew I hadn't eaten them. I kept my supplies organized, counted everything. I wasn't imagining it. It meant someone was out here. I started hiking with my rifle. I checked for tracks but didn't find any. Whoever it was, they were careful. They knew how to move without leaving much behind. Then one night, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sounds of the woods, the scurrying of small creatures, the distant calls of owls, the rustling of wind in the trees. This was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps, someone walking around the cabin. I didn't move. I lay in bed, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps stopped near the porch. Then nothing. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Couldn't tell. I just lay there, gripping the rifle, staring at the dark ceiling. Eventually, I heard the footsteps move away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I searched the area. There were no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there, but I knew what I had heard. I called it in to the main ranger station. They told me no one else was supposed to be in my section of the park. No hikers had checked in, no campers were registered. They said they'd send someone out in a few days to check in on me, just in case. That night, I locked the door, put a chair under the handle, and kept my rifle within reach. I barely slept. Every sound outside put me on edge. The wind, the creaking of the trees, the occasional distant snap of a branch. It all felt wrong. Then, around midnight, I heard the doorknob rattle. Just a slight movement like someone testing it. Then silence. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening, heart hammering in my chest. After a long time, I heard footsteps again. Slow, measured, not moving away, circling. I gripped the rifle tighter. I wanted to get up, look out the window, but some instinct kept me still. I felt like if I moved, whoever was out there would know. At some point, the sound stopped. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have because I woke up to daylight streaming through the window. The chair was still under the door handle. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, and checked around the cabin. No tracks, no signs of anyone, but I knew what I had heard. I didn't bother calling it in this time. Instead, I packed up. I wasn't waiting for whatever was out there to come back. I loaded up my truck and drove the 12 miles back to the main road. I told the rangers I was done. They didn't argue. A few weeks later, one of the other rangers called me. He told me they had sent a few guys to check out the area after I left. They didn't find anything, no sign of anyone, but they did find something in the woods about a mile from the cabin. A campsite. It had been abandoned recently. No tent, just a fire pit, a few scattered cans, and something else. A notebook. Most of the pages were ruined by the weather, but they managed to read a few. It was mostly nonsense, ramblings, but one thing stood out. A list of dates. The same nights I had heard someone outside my cabin. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. It had been a year since my wife passed away. A year since the silence in my life became something permanent, not just a momentary quiet in between our conversations. I had always thought silence was something I enjoyed, but not this kind. Not the kind that stretched out in every room, settled in my chest, and made everything feel heavier than it should. I had been driving for hours, heading nowhere in particular, just letting the road take me wherever it wanted. The truck smelled like old coffee and damp fabric. The air freshener I hung from the rearview mirror had long since lost its scent. I wasn't even sure what I was running from, only that being in my house felt unbearable. The weight of memories of her clothes still folded in drawers, of her favorite book sitting by the bed untouched. It was too much. Somewhere along the way, I ended up near the cabin. It wasn't ours, not really, but we had spent so much time there that it felt like it had been. It belonged to her uncle, a man who lived too far away to use it often, and he never minded when we stayed there. It was small, tucked deep in the woods, the kind of place that was perfect for getting away from the world. We had spent countless weekends there. In the summers, we fished in the lake and cooked outside. In the winters, we stayed inside, made coffee, and watched the snow pile up against the windows. I hadn't been back since she died. I didn't even know if I meant to go there, but when I saw the dirt road leading into the trees, I turned onto it without thinking. The road was worse than I remembered. The rain had softened the dirt, and my tires slid a little in the mud. Overgrown branches scraped against the truck. The sky was dark, heavy with low clouds. The storm had passed, but everything still felt wet, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. When I finally reached the cabin, I sat in the truck for a long time. It looked the same, but also different. The wood was darker with age, the roof sagged a little more than it used to. It was still standing, though still waiting. I forced myself to get out and unlock the door. The inside smelled like wood and dust. The air was stale, but everything was as we had left it. The old couch, the scratched-up coffee table, the framed picture of a lake hanging on the wall. I set my bag down and walked through the cabin slowly. My hands drifted over the kitchen counter, the edge of the table, the worn fabric of the couch. Felt strange being here alone. I wasn't sure how long I stood there before I noticed something was off. A smell. Not just the musty scent of a closed-up cabin, but something else. Something sour, something rotting. I walked to the kitchen first, checked the fridge. It wasn't plugged in, and there was nothing inside except an old box of baking soda. The sink was empty. The smell wasn't coming from there. I checked the bathroom next. The pipes hadn't been used in so long that the water in the toilet had dried up, but there was nothing there either. The bedroom was last. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The bed was still unmade from the last time we were there. A book lay face down on the nightstand, the pages yellowed at the edges. The smell was stronger here. I checked the closet first. Empty except for an old jacket and a few cobwebs. I crouched down to look under the bed. Nothing. Then I noticed the floor. Near the corner of the room, where the boards met the wall, there was a stain. Dark, almost black, sunk deep into the wood. It hadn't been there before. I stepped closer, and the smell hit me harder. I covered my nose with my sleeve. I had seen blood before, enough times to know what it looked like when it dried, when it sank into something porous and refused to come out. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. Something had happened here. I stepped back into the hallway, my mind racing. Had someone broken in? Had an animal gotten inside and died? I checked the windows. They were locked. The door had been locked when I arrived. There was no sign of a break-in. I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably just an old stain I hadn't noticed before. Maybe the smell was coming from something else. Maybe a dead animal had gotten under the cabin, stuck between the floorboards. I needed air. I went outside, stood on the porch, and took deep breaths. The trees stood tall around me, unmoving in the still air. The rain had stopped completely now, but everything was still damp. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the trees to the cabin, stopping at the front door. I hadn't made them. The mud was still fresh, the edges of the prints sharp. Someone had been here recently. I turned, scanning the woods. Nothing. The air felt different now, thicker, heavier. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was something else, something pressing against my ears, something making my skin feel too tight. I went back inside and locked the door. I checked every window again. They were still locked, but the footprints had been there. Someone had stood outside this cabin, watching. I sat on the couch and tried to calm down. Maybe a hiker had passed through. Maybe they saw the cabin and got curious. Maybe. I checked my phone. No signal. Not unusual out here. The night stretched on. The cabin was too quiet, every creak of the wood making me jump. I told myself I was being paranoid. I forced myself to lie down on the couch, but sleep wouldn't come. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A sound. Soft, careful. Footsteps. Right outside the window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Whoever it was, they weren't knocking. They weren't calling out. They were just there, standing, listening. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. I gripped the handle of my knife, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would shake the walls. The door stayed shut. Then the footsteps moved again, slow, deliberate, around the cabin. I heard them move past the bedroom window, past the bathroom, then silence. I stayed awake until the sun came up, gripping the knife so tight my fingers ached. When I finally dared to look outside, the footprints were gone. The mud was smooth, undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. I left that morning, didn't pack, didn't clean up, just got in my truck and drove. I never went back. I don't know what happened in that cabin, but I know one thing. I wasn't alone that night, and whoever was out there, they had been waiting, watching, and if I had opened that door, I don't think I would have made it out. I took the job without thinking too much about it. A simple gig, a way to make some extra money before winter came. The man who hired me, Mark, needed someone to watch over his cabin while he was away for a few months. It was deep in the woods, far from any towns, just a solid old place built for hunting trips and solitude. He said he'd stocked it with enough food and firewood to last through the season, and all I had to do was keep an eye on it. No big deal. I had spent time in the woods before, hiking, camping, even working in remote areas. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, I was looking forward to it. A chance to be away from everything, no noise, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the cold air. Getting there was a challenge. Mark's directions took me down a winding dirt road that felt endless. No phone signal, no signs, nothing but trees pressing in on both sides. After about an hour of driving off the main road, I finally saw the cabin. A sturdy log structure with a tin roof and a porch that looked out into the woods. A woodshed sat to the side, packed with neatly stacked logs, and a small generator was hooked up to the side of the house. The first few days were fine. I spent my time chopping extra firewood, checking the food stores, and making sure the place was in good shape. The cabin had everything I needed: canned goods, dried meat, a water pump, a propane stove, and an old wood-burning heater that kept the place warm. There was even an old radio, though it barely picked up anything but static. The nearest town was miles away. Mark told me there was an emergency radio in the cabin if anything went wrong, but besides that, I was completely cut off. It wasn't until the fourth or fifth night that I started noticing things. Little things. It started with the woods feeling different. I had always found the forest to be a peaceful place, but something felt off. The silence was too deep. At night, I should have been able to hear owls, wind rustling through the trees, distant animal sounds. But it was just quiet. A thick, heavy quiet that pressed in around the cabin. Then came the footprints. One morning, I stepped outside and saw them in the dirt near the porch. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were too large, too wide. They led from the tree line to the side of the cabin and then back into the woods. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was still locked. That night, I barely slept. I kept my rifle close, listening. Every sound made my skin crawl. The wind picked up, causing the trees to creak and groan. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had made those footprints myself and didn't realize it. But then I saw them again. A few days later, after a light snowfall, I stepped outside and found a new set of prints in the snow. This time, they were closer to the cabin. They circled it, slowly, deliberately. I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be an explanation. Maybe a hunter got lost and wandered too close. Maybe some drifter had stumbled onto the property. But if that was the case, why didn't they come to the door? Why did they just stand outside, walking in circles? That night, I sat by the window with my rifle, watching. Hours passed. The woods stayed quiet, too quiet. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start, heart pounding, my breath visible in the cold air. Something had woken me. The wind? A branch breaking? No, it was something else. I sat frozen, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not from the woods, not far away, but close, right outside. Slow, careful steps on the wooden porch. I gripped my rifle, my hands slick with sweat. My pulse was a hammer in my ears. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The steps stopped. Then, ever so softly, the door handle rattled. Not violently, not like someone trying to break in, just testing. I didn't move. The latch held. Minutes passed. Then more footsteps moving around the cabin again. I stayed awake until dawn. When I finally stepped outside, the footprints were there. Deep, clear in the snow. They led from the woods to the porch around the cabin, and then back into the trees. I couldn't stay. I packed as fast as I could, stuffing my gear into my truck, not caring if I left anything behind. The feeling in my gut was too strong, too deep. Something wasn't right. As I started the truck and pulled onto the dirt road, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin in my rearview mirror. And then, just for a second, so quick I almost thought I imagined it, I saw movement, a figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove until I was miles away, until the trees thinned and the road turned to pavement and my phone finally had signal again. I called Mark and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed and simply said, "You're not the first." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just kept driving, away from the cabin, away from whatever had been out there in the woods. I never went back. The rain started before I even reached the turnoff. It had been a long drive, longer than I remembered, the motorway stretching on endlessly, followed by winding country roads that seemed to twist deeper into nowhere. The last time I'd been out here, I was younger, barely in my 20s, helping my uncle repair the roof of the old cabin. Now, I was in my mid-30s and the place was mine. The cabin sat in the hills of Northumberland, far from anything. It had belonged to my uncle, who used it for hunting trips, but he passed away a few years back. After a messy bit of legal work, it fell to me. I hadn't thought much about it at the time, just a rundown old building in the middle of nowhere. But now, after losing my job, it seemed like a good place to get away. I turned off onto the narrow track, barely more than a dirt path. Trees loomed overhead, the rain dripping heavily through the branches. The deeper I went, the rougher the track became, deep potholes filled with water, mud slick under the tires. When I finally spotted the cabin through the trees, relief washed over me. It was just as I remembered, small, weathered, darkened by the rain. The sloped roof sagged slightly, but it still looked sturdy. I pulled up beside it and killed the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the rain against the windscreen, watching the trees sway in the wind. Then I stepped out. The air was sharp and damp, the scent of wet earth thick around me. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the door, pushing it open with some effort. Inside, it was cold, the kind of deep, settled cold that takes days to get rid of. Dust coated the surfaces. The wooden floor creaked under my boots. I set my bags down and went about checking the place over. The fireplace was intact, the old furniture still where it had always been. In the back, the small bedroom was unchanged. Narrow bed, old wooden dresser, a window looking out into the woods. I tried the light switch, but the power was out just as I expected. No electricity out here, just a generator in the shed out back. After setting up my things, I went outside to get it started. The shed was a few meters from the cabin, a small wooden structure with a sloping roof. I pulled the door open and was met with the smell of damp wood and oil. The generator sat in the corner, covered in dust. It took a few tries, but eventually, it rumbled to life, sending a dull hum through the air. By the time I got back inside, it was getting dark. I lit a few candles, built a fire, and sat down with a can of something cheap from my bag. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind picking up outside. It was strange being out here alone. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or the shifting of the trees outside. I must have dozed off at some point because when I opened my eyes, the fire had burned low and the room was colder. I stretched, rubbing my arms, and reached for the pile of wood beside the fireplace. Then I heard it, a sound outside. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. I froze, my hand gripping the log. The sound was close, just beyond the front door. I listened, my heart hammering. Another step, then nothing, just the wind again, the steady patter of rain. I told myself it was probably an animal, fox, maybe a badger. But still, I stood and crossed the room, careful not to make a sound. I reached the door and pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I debated whether to open it, but something in me hesitated. Instead, I stepped back and grabbed the heavy torch from the table. Moving to the window, I wiped away the condensation and peered out. The trees swayed, their branches casting shifting shadows in the dim light. The rain made it hard to see, but there was no movement. I stood there for a long time before finally stepping back. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone out here. The mind plays tricks in the dark. Still, I locked the door. The next morning, I woke early. The rain had stopped, leaving everything damp and silent. I stepped outside, stretching, breathing in the fresh air. The ground was soaked, the track leading up to the cabin covered in deep puddles. Then I noticed something. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had stayed inside after arriving, hadn't walked around the front at all. But there they were, deep impressions in the mud, leading from the treeline to the cabin door. I swallowed hard, staring at them. They were boot prints, large ones. Not fresh, but not old either. I crouched, touching the edge of one. The rain had softened it slightly, but it hadn't washed away completely. Whoever had been out here had come during the night. I straightened, looking toward the trees. No sign of anyone. I walked around the cabin, checking the shed, the back door, even the small window in the bedroom. Nothing had been touched. Nothing was missing, but the prints remained. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even as I chopped wood, even as I sat inside reading, that uneasy prickle stayed with me. That night, I made sure the fire was built up, the doors locked. I kept the heavy torch beside me, listening to every creak, every shift of the trees outside. At some point, I heard it again. The same sound as the night before. Footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved slowly around the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the torch. The steps were steady, circling. Whoever was out there was taking their time. Then silence. I sat there for hours, barely blinking, waiting for movement, for anything. But nothing came. The first light, I went outside. The footprints were back. This time, they circled the entire cabin. I knew then I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things fast, loading them into the car. The air was thick with damp and morning mist as I climbed in and started the engine. As I turned onto the track, I glanced back one last time. Through the trees, something moved. A figure half hidden in the mist, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I never went back. I left the cabin to rot, let the forest take it. Maybe someone else will find it one day, and maybe they'll hear the footsteps too. But I hope they're smart enough to leave the first time. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted some peace and quiet. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. But if I had known how the night would unfold, I never would have set foot in that place. It started with a simple plan. A friend of mine, more of an acquaintance really, had a cabin in the woods near a small village in France. He mentioned it offhand one evening over drinks, saying it hadn't been used in years. Said it was a perfect place to get away from the world for a while. No internet, no distractions, just trees, rain, and solitude. I liked the idea of shutting everything out for a weekend. The drive there took longer than expected. The roads were narrow, twisting through thick forest, the trees leaning in so close they nearly touched overhead. It rained the entire way, not a downpour, but a steady, persistent drizzle that clung to the windshield and blurred the edges of the world. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already dark. The place was exactly as described. Old but sturdy, built from thick wooden logs, tucked deep in the woods with nothing but trees for miles in every direction. There was a small gravel driveway leading up to it, though the stones were more mud than rock at that point. I parked, grabbed my bag, and hurried inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp wood, dust, and something stale, like old air that hadn't been moved in a long time. I flicked the light switch, and to my relief, the single overhead bulb buzzed to life. The interior was simple. A small kitchen area with outdated appliances, a stone fireplace in the corner, and a wooden table with a couple of chairs. There was a single bedroom with a basic bed, the mattress thin and hard. It wasn't much, but it would do for one night. I set my bag down and pulled off my wet jacket, draping it over the back of a chair. The rain had picked up, now hammering against the roof with a steady rhythm. I checked my phone, no signal as expected. That was fine. That was the point. I wanted to be alone. The wind picked up outside, rattling the trees. I stood by the window for a while, watching the rain roll down the glass. The forest beyond was nothing but a wall of darkness. No streetlights, no distant houses, just blackness and the sound of the storm. I made a quick meal, canned soup heated on the stove, then sat at the table listening to the rain. It was peaceful in a way, isolated but peaceful. Then the first strange thing happened. I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch snapping in the storm. But then it happened again. A rustling sound, not wind, something moving. I stood up and went to the window, squinting out into the night. Nothing, just rain and trees. But the sound had been real. Something had been out there. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. Wild boars were common in this part of France, too. That had to be it. But still, I felt uneasy. The kind of unease that settles into your bones and makes your skin feel tight. I locked the door. An hour passed. The rain continued. I sat by the fire, reading a book I had brought. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind had died down, but the rain remained, drumming a steady rhythm on the roof. Then came the second noise. This time it was closer, a crunching sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the wet gravel just outside the cabin. I froze. The sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding. The fire crackled beside me, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then a third sound. Not footsteps this time. Something sharper. A tapping noise. Against the window. I turned slowly. The rain streaked down the glass, making it hard to see. But for a moment, just a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw something. A shape, a figure standing just beyond the glass. I shot up from my chair, heart hammering. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and pointed it toward the window. Nothing, just trees and rain. But I knew what I had seen, or at least what I thought I had seen. Someone, something had been there, watching me. I double-checked the door. Still locked. The windows too. Everything was secure. But that did little to ease my nerves. I didn't go back to reading. Instead, I sat near the fire, gripping the flashlight, waiting, listening. The storm raged on. Then, just past midnight, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness. The only light came from the fire, its glow barely reaching the corners of the room. A power outage wasn't surprising in a storm like this. But the timing, right after the noises, the footsteps, the tapping, felt wrong. I grabbed my phone. Still no signal. Then, the worst sound of all. The door handle rattled. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone was trying to open the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The handle jiggled again. Harder this time. A deliberate testing motion. Then silence. The rain kept falling. The fire flickered. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Frozen. Listening. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I crept toward the door, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. I pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. And then, from outside, just beyond the door, a whisper. A sound so faint, I almost thought I imagined it. But I hadn't. Someone was out there. I backed away, heart racing. I checked the windows again. Still locked. The rain blurred the glass, making it impossible to see anything clearly. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, flashlight in hand, waiting. Morning came slowly. The rain had stopped. The first light of dawn crept through the trees, casting long shadows across the wet ground. I didn't check outside right away. I was too afraid of what I might find. But when I finally worked up the courage, I stepped onto the porch. The gravel was disturbed. Footprints, leading from the trees to the cabin. And on the window, smeared through the rain and dirt, was a single handprint. I packed my things and left without looking back. I never told my acquaintance what happened. I never asked if he had been there, if someone else had access to the cabin. I didn't want to know. I never went back, and I never will. The last time I stayed in that cabin, I knew something wasn't right. It was late October, a few years back, and I had taken some time off from work to spend a week alone in the woods. I had rented the cabin before, a small, old hunting lodge deep in the forest, far from the main road. It wasn't fancy, just a single room with a wood-burning stove, a cot, and a small kitchen setup. No running water, no electricity, just the kind of solitude I had been craving. The first few days went by quietly. The air was cold but not unbearable, and I spent most of my time hiking, collecting firewood, and just enjoying being away from everything. The nearest town was a good 40-minute drive away, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. That was part of the appeal, being completely alone. But that last night, something changed. It started with the wind. All day, the sky had been gray, but around dusk, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like something alive. I had experienced storms in the woods before, but this felt different, sharper, colder. It wasn't just the sound of branches swaying. It was a deep, low groaning, like the forest itself was shifting. I had built up a good fire in the stove, enough to keep the cabin warm through the night. I planned to get some sleep early so I could pack up and leave at first light. Then I heard it, a sound outside. It wasn't the wind. It was something deliberate, a crunch of leaves, slow, measured. I sat up on the cot, listening. The fire cracked softly in the stove, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Another step, then another. I knew the sound of animals moving through the woods. I had seen deer, foxes, even the occasional bear in these parts. But this wasn't that. This was something on two legs. I stood up slowly, moving to the window. Outside, the darkness was thick, the trees barely visible under the heavy clouds. I squinted, trying to see past the glow of the firelight reflecting on the glass. Then I saw it, a figure just at the edge of the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person, standing perfectly still. I felt my stomach drop. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. No trails, no campsites, no other cabins nearby. I reached for my hunting knife on the small wooden table beside me, gripping it tightly. My truck was parked a few yards away, but the thought of stepping outside now, in the dark, with that thing standing there, made my skin crawl. I decided to wait. The minutes stretched on. I kept my eyes on the tree line, barely blinking. The wind howled, making the branches sway, but the figure didn't move. Then, just as I was starting to doubt what I was seeing, it took a step forward. Slow, deliberate. I tightened my grip on the knife. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. Another step, and then another. I backed away from the window, moving toward the door. If this person, or whatever it was coming closer, I wasn't going to sit here and wait for them to reach the cabin. I grabbed my keys from the table and took a deep breath. The truck was my best option. If I moved fast, I could make it outside, get in, lock the doors, and drive the hell out of there. I turned the doorknob as quietly as I could. Then I yanked it open and ran. The wind hit me like a wall, cold and sharp. The ground was uneven, my boots crunching on the dirt and dead leaves. I could see the truck just ahead, the outline barely visible in the dark. Behind me, I heard movement, fast, heavy. I didn't look back. I threw myself at the truck, fumbling with the keys, my fingers stiff from the cold. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. For a second, there was silence, just my ragged breathing and the sound of my pulse hammering in my ears. Then bang, something hit the truck. Hard. I gasped, my hands fumbling to get the key into the ignition. I turned it, my breath hitching. The engine roared to life. My headlights flicked on, cutting through the darkness. And there it was, standing just a few feet in front of my truck. A man, or at least it looked like a man. He was tall, too tall. His clothes were dark, almost blending into the night. His face, something was wrong with his face. The features were twisted, like they didn't quite fit together. His eyes were too deep, his mouth just a little too wide. And he was smiling. I didn't think. I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward. For a split second, I saw him move. Fast, impossibly fast, but then he was gone. The tires kicked up dirt and leaves as I sped down the narrow path, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The trees blurred past, the headlights carving a path through the darkness. I didn't slow down, not until I hit the main road, miles away from the cabin. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching me go. I never went back. I told the owner I wouldn't be renting the cabin again, made up some excuse about work. He didn't ask questions. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, on empty roads far from the city, I catch myself glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see that face again. Watching, waiting. I had always liked taking the long way home. There was something about those quiet back roads, the ones that cut through stretches of thick woods and rolling hills, that made me feel at peace. After long days at work, dealing with the usual routine, I liked the solitude of the drive. Most people avoided those roads. They were poorly maintained, full of cracks and potholes, but I didn't mind. I knew them well. That evening, the air was heavy with rain, the sky a dull gray, and the temperature had dropped lower than usual for early autumn. I had been working late, later than I should have, and by the time I got in my truck, the sun had already set. It was one of those nights where the darkness pressed in thick around the headlights, where even the trees seemed to lean in closer to the road, swallowing up what little light I had. I wasn't in a rush, so I decided to take the old road through the valley. It cut behind the hills, away from the main highway, and wound past some of the more forgotten parts of the county. It was a road I had taken plenty of times before. About halfway down the stretch, the rain started up again, light at first, then heavier. My wipers scraped across the windshield, barely keeping up, and the road became slick beneath my tires. That's when I spotted something off to the side. A flash of wood through the trees, half hidden behind overgrown brush. I had passed this way dozens of times, but I had never noticed it before. A cabin. It wasn't anything special, just a weathered old structure, the roof sagging slightly, the walls darkened from years of neglect. It sat back from the road, tucked into the trees, just far enough to be out of sight unless you were really looking. I don't know why, but something about it made me slow down. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way it just seemed wrong, like it didn't belong there. I pulled off onto the shoulder, leaving my truck idling as I grabbed my flashlight. The rain had eased up again, but the air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and damp earth. I stepped over the ditch, pushing through the undergrowth, my boots sinking into the soft ground as I made my way toward the cabin. Close, it was worse than I thought. The door was slightly ajar, hanging loose on rusted hinges, and the windows were broken, shards of glass clinging to the frames. The wood was rotting in places, eaten away by time and weather. The place looked abandoned, but something felt off. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and decay. My flashlight beam swept across the interior, revealing a single room, dust-covered furniture, an old stove in the corner, and a wooden table with a few empty bottles scattered across it. There were no signs of life, but there were signs of something. Faint footprints in the dust. The marks weren't old. They trailed across the floor, leading toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness beyond the broken doorway. I hesitated. The place was supposed to be abandoned. It looked abandoned, but someone had been here. Recently, I turned, my flashlight catching something on the wall. Faint scratches in the wood, deep enough to gouge into the surface. At first, they seemed random, but as I moved closer, I realized they weren't. They were words. "Don't stay after dark." The letters were uneven, hurried, as if whoever had made them hadn't had much time. The sight of them sent a slow chill down my spine. I should have left. I should have turned around right then and there, walked back to my truck, and driven away without a second thought. But I didn't. Something about the place felt unfinished, like there was more I needed to see. I moved deeper into the cabin, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. Beyond the main room, there was a narrow doorway leading to what had probably been a bedroom once. The door was missing, the frame splintered, as if it had been forced open at some point. Inside, the room was almost empty. A single mattress lay against the far wall, stained and torn, and an old wooden chair sat in the corner. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite place. Something foul, something wrong. And then I saw it. In the far corner, almost hidden beneath the mattress, was a bundle of cloth. At first, I thought it was just an old blanket, discarded and forgotten. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a bag that was still tied shut. Something about it made my stomach turn. I reached down, my fingers hesitant as I pulled at the knot. The rope was stiff with age, the fabric damp and stained. The bag fell open, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Inside were clothes, old, dirty clothes, but they weren't just clothes. There were shoes, small ones, too small for an adult. And beneath them, something worse. A plastic container, its lid slightly cracked. I lifted it, my hands shaking as I pulled it open. Inside was a stack of papers, yellowed with age, covered in cramped handwriting. Notes, pages filled with scribbled words, some of them crossed out, some barely legible. But one thing stood out, a name, repeated over and over again. I didn't recognize it, but the sight of it made my skin crawl. I turned the papers over, my flashlight catching something on the last page. Something scrawled hastily across the bottom in dark ink. Still here. A sound echoed behind me, soft, faint, like footsteps. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room. Nothing, but the air had changed. It was heavier now, thick with something unseen. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I turned and bolted. I didn't care about the rain, about the mud sucking at my boots, about the branches tearing at my arms as I pushed my way back to my truck. I got in, slammed the door shut, and locked it. For a long moment, I just sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly. My headlights illuminated the path back to the road, the cabin now nothing more than a shadow among the trees. I left. I didn't look back. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when the roads are empty and the world is quiet, I still think about that place, about the bag, about the words carved into the wall, and about the feeling that, even now, lingers at the back of my mind, like something watching, like something waiting, and I know, without a doubt, that I should have never stopped. I never wanted the cabin. It was left to me after my uncle passed away, a man I barely knew, who spent the last years of his life living alone deep in the woods, right next to an old, abandoned graveyard. The kind of place people avoided, the kind of place with stories attached to it, ones I had heard in passing but never paid attention to. Now, it belonged to me. I was in no rush to visit, but leaving it to rot wasn't an option, and selling it without seeing it first didn't sit right with me. So, on a cold autumn afternoon, I packed up my truck and made the drive out. The closer I got, the worse the road became. First paved, then gravel, then a narrow dirt path winding through trees that pressed in close on both sides. The sky was overcast, dull gray, the kind of light that makes everything look flat and lifeless. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I hesitated before getting out. The cabin itself was in rough shape, wooden walls darkened with age, the roof sagging in places, the windows covered in grime. It had a small front porch, the railing half collapsed, weeds growing through the floorboards. To the right, just beyond a break in the trees, was the graveyard. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. The headstones were old, crooked, some leaning so far they looked ready to fall. Others were broken, their pieces scattered, half buried under leaves. The names carved into them were worn down, barely readable. The whole place had an unnatural stillness to it, not quiet in the normal sense, more like the air was waiting for something. I shook it off and went inside. The inside of the cabin was just as neglected, dust thick on every surface, cobwebs in the corners, a musty smell that reminded me of old books and damp wood. There was a kitchen to the left, a small living space with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom in the back. The furniture was old, heavy, and worn but still sturdy. I checked the cabinets and found a few cans of food, rusted at the edges but unopened. My uncle must have been here right up until he couldn't be. I spent the next few hours cleaning, sweeping, clearing out old junk, airing the place out. By the time the sun started going down, I was exhausted. I made a quick dinner from the supplies I'd brought, sat at the small kitchen table, and tried not to think about how quiet it was. Then I heard it, a rustling outside, in the leaves near the graveyard. I froze, listened. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finished eating, forced myself to ignore it, and got ready for bed. That night, I barely slept. Every sound had me wide awake, listening. I heard the wind moving through the trees, the creak of old wood as the cabin settled. But then there were other sounds. Footsteps in the leaves. Not constant, just now and then. Slow, deliberate. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but it didn't sound like one. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside the cabin. Human tracks, barefoot, leading from the edge of the graveyard, circling the cabin, then disappearing back into the trees. I stood there, staring at them, feeling my stomach twist. The prints weren't old. The edges were sharp, untouched by wind or rain. Whoever had made them had been here last night. I told myself I had two choices. I could leave, forget about the cabin, let it sit empty and rotting. Or I could stay, find out who or what was out here, and deal with it. I stayed. The second night was worse. I locked the doors, checked the windows, made sure everything was secure. I sat in the living room, a flashlight in my hand, waiting. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement again, closer this time. Slow footsteps moving around the cabin. Then a sound at the door, a light scratch, like fingernails dragging across wood. I didn't move, just sat there, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers ached. The scratching stopped. Then the footsteps moved to the window. I turned the flashlight off, held my breath. A shadow passed across the glass. I couldn't see details, just the shape of a person standing right outside, pressed close to the window. I wanted to move, to grab the gun I had in my bag, but I was frozen. My mind felt locked, my body unwilling to respond. Then the shadow moved, slid away from the window, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, heart hammering. The first light, I went outside. More tracks in the dirt, leading from the graveyard. This time, I followed them. They led me to a grave near the back, where the trees pressed in close. A headstone cracked down the middle. The name was worn away, unreadable, but the earth in front of it had been disturbed. Not dug up, but shifted. Someone had been here recently. I looked around, feeling exposed. Watched. The trees were too thick, the shadows too deep. I turned and walked back to the cabin, forcing myself not to run. That evening, I packed up. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my truck, I glanced at the graveyard one last time, and I saw it. A figure standing among the headstones, not moving, just watching. I didn't wait. I got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. I never went back. Didn't try to sell the cabin, didn't check in on it. As far as I was concerned, it didn't exist anymore. A few months later, I got curious. Looked up the history of the area of the graveyard. The last person buried there? My uncle. I never expected to inherit anything from my uncle. He was a quiet man, not exactly a recluse, but he kept to himself. He had a small place deep in the woods, the kind of cabin you'd picture an old-timer living in, surrounded by trees, miles from the nearest town. He liked it that way. When I was a kid, I'd visit a few times, but I never got attached to the place. It was too quiet, too isolated. So when he passed and I found out he left the cabin to me, I wasn't sure what to do with it. I had no plans to move out there, but selling it would be a hassle. It was a 3-hour drive from where I lived, way off the main roads. No one would want to buy it unless they were looking to disappear. At first, I thought I'd just go out there, take a look, and figure out what to do next. Maybe clean the place up, see if anything was worth keeping. A weekend trip at most. That was the plan. I packed light, just some food, water, and a sleeping bag. The drive was long, the roads winding through thick woods, with barely any signs of civilization. I had to turn off onto an unmarked dirt path that stretched for miles before I finally saw the cabin. It looked just like I remembered. Small, with a sagging roof and a porch that creaked under my weight. The windows were intact, but the place had an abandoned feel. A thick layer of dust covered everything inside, and the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and dampness. I spent the first few hours cleaning. Most of my uncle's things were still there: old furniture, tools, canned food that was probably years past its expiration date. I didn't touch much, just cleared out some space, set up my sleeping bag, and made sure the place was secure. By the time the sun started setting, the forest outside felt different. The way the trees swayed in the wind, the way the shadows stretched across the ground, it gave me an uneasy feeling. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but I was definitely aware of how alone I was out there. That first night was when things started feeling off. I woke up in the middle of the night, not sure why. The cabin was silent, but something felt wrong. It was that deep, gut-level feeling, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I sat up, listening, my heart beat loud in my ears. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, just beyond the cabin walls. It wasn't an animal, not the rustling of leaves or the snap of a branch. It was deliberate, slow, careful footsteps. I told myself it was probably nothing. A deer, maybe, but something in me knew better. I stayed still, barely breathing, waiting to hear it again. A long minute passed, then another. Nothing. Eventually, I laid back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and I saw them, footprints. Not animal tracks, human. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin, right up to one of the windows. Then they turned back. I stared at them for a long time, my mind running through possibilities. A hunter? Some lost hiker? But why come right up to the cabin and then leave? I shook it off and went about my day. But that feeling stuck with me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. That night, I barricaded the door. I found an old hunting rifle my uncle had left behind, checked if it was loaded, and kept it close. I wasn't planning on using it, but it made me feel better having it nearby. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night, but this time it wasn't just a feeling. There was a sound, a slow, deliberate tap, 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 coming from the window. I didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest, my fingers tightening around the rifle. The tapping continued, steady, patient. Then it stopped. Silence stretched out. I stayed frozen, waiting, listening. Then I heard footsteps again, slow, moving around the cabin. I didn't move until the sun started to rise. When I finally stepped outside, my stomach dropped. More footprints, fresh ones, circling the cabin. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and got in my truck. The drive back to town felt longer than before, my mind replaying the sounds from the night before. I told myself it was probably some local messing with me. Maybe some hunter who didn't want me there. Maybe a squatter. I didn't know, and I didn't care. I wasn't going back. A week later, I put the cabin up for sale. No one was interested. Months passed. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching me. Then one day I got a call. It was from the sheriff's office in that county. They found a body. Some drifter, they said. He had been living out in the woods, not far from my uncle's cabin. They weren't sure how long he had been out there. I asked where they found him. Not far, they said. Less than half a mile from the cabin. The worst part? They found a knife on him, and a notebook. Inside were pages of notes. About the cabin. About me. I never went back. I was 26 when my cousin Mark invited me to his cabin for a weekend of hunting. It was late October, cold enough for the leaves to have turned, but not quite winter yet. The trees were mostly bare, their twisted branches reaching into the sky like skeletal fingers. Mark's cabin was deep in the woods, nearly 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but endless trees and the occasional dirt road that led to nowhere. I had been to the cabin once before, a few years back, but I barely remembered it. What I did remember was how isolated it was. There were no other houses around for miles, no cell service, and no electricity apart from a gas generator. Mark only ran when necessary. Mark was the kind of guy who liked being alone. He had grown up in the city like me, but after a rough divorce, he had moved out here and made the cabin his full-time home. He hunted, fished, and lived off the land as much as he could. I didn't see him often, but when he invited me up for a weekend, I figured it would be a nice break from my routine. I arrived late in the afternoon, my truck kicking up dirt as I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was a modest place, built from thick logs, with a tin roof and a porch that looked out over the woods. A stack of firewood was piled up neatly by the door, and Mark's old pickup was parked nearby. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and damp clothes. The walls were lined with hunting gear, old photographs, and shelves filled with canned food and supplies. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove and 2 bedrooms. The place felt lived in, comfortable, but there was something about being this deep in the woods that always put me a little on edge. We spent the first evening drinking beer and catching up. Mark told me about his hunting trips, about how he had seen fresh deer tracks just the other morning. We planned to head out before sunrise to track them. That night, I slept in the small guest room at the back of the cabin. The wind howled outside, rattling the tin roof, and somewhere in the distance, I heard an animal call, long and drawn out, almost like a scream. I told myself it was just a coyote and pulled the blankets up higher. We were up before dawn, rifles slung over our shoulders as we made our way into the woods. The air was freezing, our breath coming out in thick clouds. The ground was covered in frost, crunching under our boots. Mark led the way, moving silently, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks. After about an hour, we found fresh deer prints in the soft earth. They were deep, meaning the animal had passed through recently. We followed them, moving deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, their trunks pressing close together, blocking out the morning light. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of our boots on the ground. After another 20 minutes, we came to a small clearing. That's when we saw them. 2 sets of tracks. The first set belonged to the deer. The second set, larger, heavier, belonged to a man. I looked at Mark and he looked at me. Neither of us said anything, but we both understood what we were seeing. Someone had been out here, walking barefoot in the woods, following the same deer we were tracking. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Who the hell would be out here, miles from anywhere, walking around with no shoes? Mark knelt down, studying the tracks. "Fresh," he muttered under his breath. I didn't respond. I just tightened my grip on my rifle and scanned the trees around us. I suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. We decided to keep moving. Maybe it was some drifter or a hunter who had lost his boots. Either way, we weren't about to let it ruin our trip. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We made it back to the cabin by mid-afternoon. We hadn't seen any deer, and after finding those tracks, neither of us felt like staying out any longer. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. We chopped wood, made dinner, and tried to shake off the unease we felt in the woods. But as night fell, that feeling returned. Mark locked the doors, something he told me he never usually did. "Just in case," he said. We sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames doing little to ease my nerves. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees like a living thing. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching. I told myself it was just the wind. At some point, Mark went to bed, but I stayed up, sitting in the dim light of the fire, listening. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I held my breath, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right outside the window behind me. I didn't turn around, couldn't. I just sat there, gripping my rifle, listening to the silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I waited another hour before I finally worked up the courage to move. I crept to Mark's room and woke him up. "There's someone outside," I whispered. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for me to follow. We stepped out onto the porch, flashlights in hand. The woods were still, the air thick with silence. Then Mark's light landed on something near the tree line. A footprint, large, bare, and fresh. We didn't sleep that night. By morning, we made a decision. We were leaving. Mark packed his things while I loaded my truck. We didn't talk about what had happened, but we both knew whoever had been out there wasn't just passing through. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a man. Tall, thin, completely still, watching us leave. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse hammering. We didn't stop until we hit the main road. Neither of us ever went back to the cabin, and neither of us ever talked about what we saw. But to this day, I still think about that footprint, and I still wonder, how long had he been watching us before we even noticed?